Hi, welcome to AP Psychology, Chapter 8. Our topic for this episode will be learning. Uh, what we will be seeking to find out is how do we learn? We will talk about classical conditioning and Pavlov's experiments, extending Pavlov's understanding, and Pavlov's legacy. Uh, then we'll begin discussing about operant conditioning, Skinner's experiments, extending Skinner's legacy, and in contrasting classical and operant conditioning. Then we'll discuss learning by observation, the Bandura experiments, and applications of observational learning. Learning is relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience. Learning is more flexible in comparison to genetically programmed behavior of Chinooks, for example. Learning helps us to adapt our environment. Pavlov explored classical conditioning in which we learn to anticipate events such as being fed or experiencing pain. In famous studies, Pavlov presented neutral stimulus just before an unconditioned stimulus, which normally triggered an unconditioned response. After several repetitions, the neutral stimulus alone began triggering a conditioned response resembling the unconditioned response. The behaviorist optimism that learning principles would generalize from one response to another and from one species to another has been tempered. We now know that conditioning principles are cognitively and biologically constrained. While in classical conditioning we learn to associate two stimuli, in operant conditioning we learn to associate a response and its consequence. Skinner showed that rats should be shaped with their reinforcement to display successfully closer approximations of desired behavior. Researchers have also studied the effects of positive and negative reinforcers, primarily conditioned reinforcers and immediate and delayed reinforcers. Critics point to the research on latent learning to support their claim that Skinner underestimated the importance of the cognitive restraints. Now, although Skinner's emphasis on the external control also stimulated much debate regarding human freedom and the ethics of managing people, his operant principles are being applied in schools, sports, workplaces, and homes. A third type of learning important among higher animals is what Albert Bandura calls observational learning. Children tend to imitate what model does and says, and whenever the behavior is pro-social or anti-social, research suggests that violence on television leads to aggressive behavior by children and teenagers who watch such programs. So this topic here is we're going to define learning and identify two forms of learning. Learning is a relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience. Nature's most important gift to us may be our adaptability, our capacity to learn new behaviors that enable us to cope with ever-changing experiences. We learn by association and how our naturally connect events that occur in sequence. 2,000 years ago, Aristotle suggested this law of association. Then 200 years ago, we had Locke and Hume who reiterated this law, that we learn much from our experiences. They did experiments on stimulus to stimulus learning to associate one stimulus with another event. What they did was they exposed snails to a splash of water, and then they would give the snail a shock on his tail, and so with each splash of water, and so then they would recoil from this, and these sea snails would then learn from this experience. Another form that you may be readily aware of is the stimulus to stimulus learning, where we learn to associate one thing with another. Here you see the stimulus of lightning plus the loud crack of thunder. And so as a child, we begin to associate this concept of seeing lightning as this terrible noise coming right behind it. In fact, my own recollection is in my own childhood was that my father had to, we went out in the garage with the garage door open because I was deathly afraid every time there was a thunderstorm, and he sat with me and reassured me that every time I saw that crack of lightning, that all it was going to be a loud noise and it was nothing to be afraid of. Response consequence learning, learning to associate response with a consequence, is another form of learning that we see. We see this when we go to animal shows where they have the seals, or like SeaWorld used to be famous for this, where they would get the animals to do various tricks, and of course they would award them for doing those behaviors through the consequence of receiving food, so that whenever the seal learns to balance the ball on his nose, he gets a fish. And so this is how it is developed. And we'll talk more about this later. Response consequence learning is to associate the response with a consequence. The response of pushing a vending machine button, and just for the sake of pushing it, and every once in a while you might get a candy bar, and so there you go. The behavior is strengthened. Back in the day, there used to be these things called payphones that they'd have on the walls, and oftentimes you would see people go through the payphones, reaching into the coin slots all the time. And the coin slots are usually empty, but on occasion, somebody would learn that as long as they checked it, that every once in a while they might get a quarter in the coin slot, because sometimes people forget to take their change with them. So now, of course, the hero of classical conditioning is a guy by the name of Ivan Pavlov. His ideas of classical conditioning originate from old philosophical theories. However, it was a Russian physiologist who elucidated classical conditioning. His work provided the basis of later behaviorists like John Watson and B.F. Skinner. Pavlov explored the phenomenon we call classical conditioning, in which organisms associate stimuli and thus associate events. This laid to the foundation of John Watson's behaviorism, which held that psychology should be an objective science that studied only observable behavior. Pavlov, who repeatedly present neutral stimulus, such as a tone, just before the unconditioned stimulus, such as food, which triggered the unconditioned response, and after several repetitions of the tone alone, now the conditioned stimulus began triggering a conditioned response, salivation. Unconditioned means unlearned, conditioned means learned. Thus, the unconditioned response is an event that occurs naturally, a response to stimuli. So the dog's salivation to food is a natural unconditioned response. A unconditioned stimulus is something that naturally and automatically triggers the unlearned response, and a conditioned stimulus is an originally neutral stimulus that learned through learning. It comes to be associated with some unlearned response. A conditioned response is the learned response to the original neutral but now conditioned stimulus. So during conditioning, the neutral stimulus and the unconditional stimulus of food are paired, resulting with salivation. After the conditioning, the neutral stimulus, now the conditioned stimulus, elicits salivation, now the conditioned response. The acquisition is in the initial stage in the classical conditioning, in which the association between a neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus takes place. In most cases, for conditioning to occur, the neutral stimulus needs to come before the unconditioned stimulus. the time in between the two stimuli should be about half a second. Now what we're going to discuss is the timing requirements for the initial learning of a stimulus response. Response are required that is initially learned, but best when the conditioned stimulus is presented a half second before the unconditioned stimulus. This finding demonstrates how classical conditioning is biologically adaptive. Now, we're going to summarize the process of extinction and spontaneous recovery and generalization of discovery. In this example that we have here, the conditioned stimulus needs to come half a second before the unconditioned stimulus for acquisition. The author of our book had an interesting experience when he was a young man where he would have a passionate kiss with this girl. And this would, of course, as you would expect, lead to unconditioned response of sexual arousal. But this girl that he was dating had a desire to eat a lot of foods that had onions, and so she had onion breath. And so the unconditioned stimulus was the passionate kiss, but then he had the unconditioned sexual response. But he also had the conditioned stimulus of onion breath is with it, and eventually just the smell of onion would lead to the conditioned response of making him aroused. So we can extend that to other things in our lives. So extinction is when the unconditioned stimulus of food does not follow the conditioned stimulus, the tone. The conditioned response begins to decrease and eventually causes extinction. Extinction refers to the diminishing of a conditioned response when conditioned stimulus occurs repeatedly without unconditioned stimulus. Spontaneous recovery is the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished conditioned response. Generalization is the tendency to respond to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. So after a rest period, an extinguished conditioned response of salivation spontaneously recovers, but if the conditioned stimulus or the tone persists alone, the conditioned response becomes extinct again. However, discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other irrelevant stimuli. Now, we're going to talk about stimulus generalization, and we're going to talk about the survival value of generalization and discrimination. Generalization has a survival value because it extends the learned response to other stimuli in a given category. For example, fleeing from all dangerous animals. The tendency to respond to stimuli to the conditioned stimulus is called generalization. Pavlov conditioned the dog's salivization, the conditioned response, by using miniature vibrators, the conditioned stimulus, on the thigh, and then he had subsequently stimulated other parts of the dog's body and the salivation dropped. Discrimination has a survival value because it limits our learned responses to an appropriate stimuli. For example, fleeing from a rampaging lion, but not from a playful kitten. So stimulus discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between conditioned stimulus and other stimuli do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. So we're going to stop there, and we're going to pick up next time with extending Pavlov's understanding on our next video. And so this is the end of chapter 8, part 1 of our lecture.